Picture a machine the size of a locomotive, bolted to a platform of old-growth logs, sitting in the middle of a forest with no road for 50 miles in any direction. A steel cable, thick as a man's forearm, runs from its drum through a block hung high in a spar tree, then disappears into the timber 1,000 feet away. The cable is under tens of thousands of pounds of tension. It is pulling a Douglas fir log that weighs more than a loaded freight car. And somewhere between the machine and the log, a man is standing in the brush. His job is to unhook the choker chain when the log reaches the landing. He does this every few minutes, all day long, from first light until dark. He earns $3 a day. He cannot hear the signal whistle over the noise of the engine. He cannot see the cable through the undergrowth. He can only feel the vibration in the ground when the log starts moving. On a Tuesday morning in 1902, near Cass Bay, Oregon, the cable snapped. It came back like a bullwhip made of steel, traveling at over 100 miles per hour. It cut a man named Carl Hendricks nearly in half. The camp ledger recorded his name, his wages owed, and the cost of shipping his body downriver. They had the machine running again before noon. This is the story of the steam donkey, the machine that dragged the great forests of the Pacific Northwest to the river. The machine that built the cities of the American West and killed the men who operated it in numbers that would be criminal by any modern standard. And the machine that most people have never heard of. To understand why anyone would build a 40-ton steam engine and drop it in the middle of a forest, you need to understand what the loggers of the Pacific Northwest were up against. And that means you need to stand at the base of an old-growth tree and look straight up until your neck aches. If you have never seen a Douglas fir that has been growing undisturbed for 500 years, you cannot appreciate what these men faced. These were not the white pines of New England or the hardwoods of the Appalachian Hills. The trees of the Pacific Northwest were something from another geological era entirely. A mature Douglas fir could stand over 300 feet tall. That is taller than the Statue of Liberty from the base of the pedestal to the tip of the torch. The trunk could measure 15 to 20 feet in diameter at the base. A single tree could contain enough lumber to frame and finish 40 houses, and the forests were thick with them, stretching unbroken from Northern California through Oregon and Washington and up into British Columbia. Millions upon millions of acres of timber so dense and so dark that sunlight barely reached the forest floor. The western red cedars were nearly as massive. Sitka spruce grew to 250 feet. The forest canopy was so high and so continuous that walking beneath it felt less like being in the woods and more like being inside a cathedral built by something that didn't care whether humans ever found it. Now, by the 1870s, the timber industry had already chewed through the forests of the Great Lakes region, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota. The great white pine stands that had seemed limitless a generation earlier were stumps and scrub land. The industry needed new timber, and the railroads pushing west had opened a market that was screaming for wood. San Francisco was growing at a pace that ate lumber faster than it could be shipped. Portland and Seattle were rising from mudflats into real cities. The entire Pacific coast needed building material, and the forests above it held more board feet of standing timber than the rest of the continent combined. But here was the problem. Everything that had worked in the forests of Michigan and Wisconsin was completely, laughably useless in the Pacific Northwest. Back east, a logging crew would fell a tree with axes and crosscut saws, hitch the log to a team of oxen or horses, and drag it along a skid road to the nearest river or rail spur. The trees were manageable, 30, maybe 40 feet tall, a few feet in diameter. Heavy, certainly, but a skilled teamster with a strong pair of draft horses could move them. The terrain cooperated. Rolling hills, frozen rivers in winter for ice roads, relatively flat ground between the stumps. In the Pacific Northwest, the trees did not cooperate. A single old-growth Douglas fir log could weigh 60,000 pounds or more. You could hitch every horse in the county to one end, and they would not move it an inch. The terrain was even worse than the timber. The coastal ranges of Oregon and Washington are steep, tangled mountains covered in undergrowth, so thick you need a machete to walk through it. Ravines 100 feet deep, where slopes that go straight up at angles a goat would think twice about. And the rain. The western slopes of the Cascades and the Coast Range receive between 80 and 120 inches of rain a year. In the logging season, which ran roughly from spring through fall, the ground was a perpetual swamp of mud, rotting vegetation, and standing water. Horses sank to their bellies, oxen broke their legs in hidden ravines. Skid roads, among those primitive paths where logs were laid crosswise and greased with dogfish oil to let timber slide over them, worked on relatively flat ground and for relatively small logs. For the monsters of the old growth, they were a joke. You would need a skid road wide enough to drive a house down, and you would need to rebuild it after every log passed. Some operations tried splash dams. The idea was simple enough. Dam a creek, let the water build up behind it, fill the pond with logs, and then blow the dam and let the wall of water carry the timber downstream. It worked sometimes. It also scoured the stream beds down to bare rock, killed every salmon in the drainage, and occasionally swept away entire camps, including the men in them. In 1890, a splash dam failure on the Clearwater River in Idaho killed at least 6 men whose bodies were never recovered from the debris. Flumes were another attempt. Long wooden channels, like elevated troughs, I filled with running water that carried logs for miles down mountainsides. Flumes were expensive to build, brutally expensive to maintain, and they required terrain that cooperated with a consistent downhill grade. When a log jam formed inside a flume, and they formed regularly, someone had to climb into that channel with the water rushing past and the weight of backed up logs pressing forward and clear it by hand. The men who did this work were called flume herders, and they died with a regularity that suggests the job was less occupation and more ongoing emergency. The industry was stuck. It was sitting on the most valuable forest in the world, and it could barely move the timber. In 1881, a man named John Dolbeer changed everything. Dolbeer was not a mechanical engineer. He had no formal technical training. He was a logger and mill owner operating out of Eureka, California, on Humboldt Bay, and he had spent years watching his crews struggle and fail to move big timber efficiently. He understood the problem the way only a man losing money every single day can understand a problem, not as a theory, as a wound. His solution was so simple it bordered on obvious, which is probably why nobody else had thought of it. Take a small stationary steam engine, the kind already common in sawmills and machine shops, mount it on a sled built from heavy timbers, attach a spool to the drive shaft, wind cable onto the spool, run the cable out into the forest, hook it to a log, and let the engine winch the log back to the machine. That was the entire idea, a steam-powered winch on a sled. The first Dolbeer donkey engine, demonstrated in the woods near Eureka in 1881, was crude to the point of comedy. A single vertical cylinder, open gears that would rip the fingers off any man careless enough to reach near them. A small spool that held maybe 1,000 feet of manila rope, is because wire cable was not yet standard. The machine was slow, it was loud. It overheated constantly. It required a dedicated fireman to keep the boiler fed and a dedicated operator to manage the drum, and neither man could see what was happening at the other end of the cable. One old bull teamster who watched the first demonstration reportedly said he could move more wood with a good pair of horses than that smoking contraption would ever manage. He was right, for about 6 months. Because Dolbeer kept improving it. He replaced the manila rope with wire cable, which was stronger, lighter for its strength, and didn't rot in the rain. He enlarged the drum to hold more cable. He upgraded the boiler for more power. He added a second drum so the machine could haul the main line out and reel it back without manual resetting. By 1885, improved versions of Dolbeer's donkey engine had spread up the entire Pacific coast. Other manufacturers saw the opportunity and jumped in. Willamette Iron Works in Portland began building their own designs. Washington Iron Works in Seattle. Each generation of machine was bigger, more powerful, and more capable than the last. The small single-spool donkeys of the early 1880s gave way to 2-drum machines, then 3-drum machines. Boilers grew from 8 horsepower to 12 to 20 to 50 to over 100. The cable capacity expanded from 1,000 feet to 2,000 to 3,000. and while the machines themselves swelled from a few tons to 10 to 20 to 40 or more. By 1900, a full-sized logging donkey was a true industrial beast. It weighed as much as 40 tons. It carried enough cable to reach half a mile into the forest. Its boiler operated at pressures that would terrify a modern safety inspector. Its drum could reel in a log the size of a rail car at a walking pace, dragging it up slopes that no animal could climb and through terrain that no road could cross. But the evolution of the machine did not stop there, and each new stage opened timber that had been completely impossible to reach before. The first Dolbeer-style ground lead donkeys simply dragged logs along the surface of the forest floor. This worked on reasonably flat terrain, but on steep slopes, the logs dug into the earth, caught behind stumps, and buried themselves in mud until the cable snapped or the choker tore loose. So the engineers went vertical. The high lead system, developed in the early 1900s, changed the game entirely. Instead of pulling the cable along the ground, it ran through a block mounted high on a spar tree, sometimes 150 feet up. When the donkey hauled on the main line, the leading end of the log lifted off the ground and the log came crashing through the slash nose up, riding over obstacles that would have stopped a ground lead system cold. Timber on steep hillsides that no one had been able to touch was suddenly available. Then came the skyline system, which pushed the concept even further. A fixed cable called the skyline was strung between two spar trees on opposite ridges, spanning an entire valley. Logs were hooked to a carriage that rode along this skyline, lifted completely off the ground, and ferried from one side of a canyon to the other. A ravine that would have defeated any ground operation, a valley that no horse on earth could have crossed, hauling a 60,000-pound log. Why was now just another day at work. Each of these innovations made the steam donkey more productive, but each one also made it more lethal. Higher cables stored more energy when they snapped. Suspended logs meant heavier objects falling from greater heights onto the men working below. Longer cable runs meant more distance between the donkey operator and the choker setters out in the brush, more time between a signal and a response, more seconds for something to go catastrophically wrong. The machine that one old teamster had dismissed as inferior to a pair of horses was now the beating heart of every logging operation west of the Cascades, and the forests would never be the same. Now we need to talk about what it was like to build a logging operation around one of these machines. Because the steam donkey didn't just change how logs were moved, it reorganized the entire structure of a logging camp, from where men slept to how they died. Setting up a steam donkey operation began with the camp boss and the timber cruiser walking the forest. The cruiser's job was to estimate the board feet of merchantable timber in a given area and plan the cutting order. Together, they chose the setting, the location where the donkey would be positioned while it worked the surrounding timber. The setting had to balance several needs: close enough to water for the boiler, stable enough ground to anchor the machine, central enough to reach the timber in all directions. Getting the donkey to the setting was a feat of engineering in itself. These machines weighed 40 tons, remember, and there were no roads. The solution was almost absurdly self-referential. The donkey moved itself. Crews would anchor cables to large stumps ahead of the machine, and the donkey would winch itself forward along its own sled, dragging its enormous weight over the forest floor a few hundred feet at a time. This process was called walking the donkey, and it was exactly as slow and destructive as it sounds. The ground beneath the sled was torn to pieces, stumps were ripped out, soil was churned into trenches. A donkey walking through the forest left a path of destruction that looked like a small tornado had crawled along the ground. Once the donkey reached its setting, it was anchored in place with guy lines. These were heavy cables running from the machine to the largest, most solid stumps available in multiple directions, holding the engine steady against the thousands of pounds of pulling force it would generate during operation. If a guy line anchor failed while the donkey was hauling under full load, the entire machine could lurch sideways. Men near the machine when this happened were crushed or struck by the whipping cable. It happened more often than the timber companies admitted. Then came the rigging of the spar tree. This was the job of the high climber. And if any job in the logging camp deserved the word legendary, it was this one. The high climber selected the tallest, straightest tree near the donkey's setting. He strapped steel climbing spurs to the insides of his boots, wrapped a heavy leather and rope climbing belt around his waist and the trunk of the tree, and started climbing. Up he went, 40 feet, 60, 80, 100. At each stage, he chopped off the branches with a hand axe as he ascended, the limbs crashing through the canopy and hitting the ground below while the rest of the crew watched from a safe distance, safe being a relative term. When the high climber reached the desired height, which could be 150 feet or more, he would saw off the top of the tree with a crosscut saw. The moment the top separated, the entire trunk would sway violently in a wide arc, whipping back and forth like a massive pendulum with a man strapped to it. The high climber rode this motion, clinging to the shaking trunk, 150 feet above the ground, until the oscillations dampened and the tree steadied. Then he would signal down, and the rigging crew would begin hauling up the blocks. These were massive steel pulleys, some weighing several hundred pounds, through which the mainline cable would run. And the blocks were manhandled up the spar tree and bolted into position by riggers working on small wooden platforms lashed to the trunk at dizzying heights. Every nut, every bolt, every shackle was inspected by the rigging slinger, because a block that failed under load at 150 feet would come down like a bomb. With the spar tree rigged and the donkey anchored, the operation was ready to log, and now the choker setters went to work. The choker setter had the most dangerous job in the woods, and the numbers prove it. He worked far from the donkey, out in the slash and brush at the other end of the mainline cable. When the fallers dropped a tree and the buckers cut it into logs, the choker setter dragged a heavy steel noose called a choker around one end of the log and hooked it to the mainline. Then he gave the signal, a series of whistle blasts relayed back to the donkey engineer, and the engine began hauling. The instant that cable went taut under load, the choker setter's world became a killing field. He had to get clear of the log, clear of the cable, and clear of anything the log might hit on its way to the landing. A log being dragged by a steam donkey through rough terrain does not travel in a polite straight line. It catches on stumps and kicks violently sideways. It rides up over boulders and drops back to the ground with a crash that shakes the earth. It pivots around obstacles, and the back end swings through the brush like a battering ram. The cable itself, running through blocks and over the ground, can snag on a root or a stump and then release with explosive force, whipping through the air fast enough to cut a man in two. Every choker setter knew men who had died. Many had seen it happen. The veterans moved with a constant, practiced alertness, always knowing where the cable was, where the log was, where the nearest large stump was that they could dive behind. New men were watched carefully by the crew because a green choker setter who didn't know when to run was a danger not just to himself, but to everyone around him. Camp records from the Pacific Northwest tell a story the industry never advertised. In Washington state, logging killed an average of 300 men per year during the peak decades from 1900 to 1930. Oregon's numbers were comparable. British Columbia's were proportionally similar. Most of these deaths occurred in cable logging operations centered around steam donkeys. Cable snap was the most feared way to die because it was the most sudden. 1,000-foot length of 1.25-inch wire cable under full hauling tension stores an enormous amount of potential energy. When it breaks, the severed ends travel faster than the eye can follow. The sound, a sharp metallic crack followed by a rising whine, was the last thing some men ever heard. In the camps around Gray's Harbor, Washington, during the 1904 season alone, at least 14 men were killed by cable failure. Their names appear in payroll records and company ledgers. Arthur Billings, 22 years old, a Swedish immigrant named Lindqvist, whose first name nobody bothered to record. A man listed simply as Indian Joe, who had worked the chokers for 3 seasons without a scratch before his luck ended on a clear morning in April. Boiler explosions were another constant terror. Steam donkey boilers operated at pressures that pushed the limits of the cast iron and riveted steel they were built from. Maintenance was performed by the operators themselves, not by certified engineers, and in the wet, filthy, corrosive environment of a logging camp, boilers deteriorated fast, crown sheets thinned, stay bolts corroded, Safety valves, the last line of defense against overpressure, rusted shut or were deliberately wired closed by operators who wanted more steam pressure for heavy pulls. When a boiler let go, it was catastrophic. The rapid phase change of superheated water into steam created an explosion that could level everything within a 50-foot radius. Cast iron fragments became shrapnel. Scalding water sprayed in every direction. Men who survived the initial blast often died of burns within hours or days, in agony, in a camp with no doctor and no morphine, and 50 miles from the nearest hospital. In 1905, near Aberdeen, Washington, a donkey boiler exploded and killed 3 men outright. A fourth, the fireman who had been stoking the box minutes before the failure, survived for 2 days with burns covering most of his body. The camp cook sat with him through both nights. There was nothing else anyone could do. Fire was the third killer, and in some ways the most destructive. A steam donkey had an open firebox that threw sparks. It sat in a forest surrounded by slash, the accumulated debris of bark, branches, broken tops, and wood chips that logging operations generated in enormous quantities. In dry weather, a single spark landing in a pile of slash could start a fire that moved faster than a man could run through tangled undergrowth. The Yakult burn of 1902 killed 38 people and scorched over 200,000 acres of timber in southwest Washington. The Tillamook burn of 1933 destroyed over 300,000 acres of old-growth forest in Oregon's Coast Range. These were not small brush fires. These were firestorms that created their own weather, generating winds that drove the flames at speeds that trapped men with no chance of escape. While the ignition sources of the largest fires are debated, steam donkey operations were confirmed or suspected contributors to fire after fire across the region. The loggers who survived all of this went back to camp and lived in conditions that modern workers would not tolerate for an hour. Bunkhouses were wooden sheds with rows of bunks stacked 2 and 3 high. Mattresses were straw ticking that hosted populations of lice and bed bugs. Clothes were dried by the bunkhouse stove overnight and put on again damp in the morning. Bathing was weekly at best. The smell of a logging bunkhouse at the end of the day is something that survivors described in terms that don't bear repeating. Food was the one area where camps competed. A logging camp that fed its men poorly lost its crew, because loggers would simply walk out and sign on with a camp that had a better cook. A working logger burned 5,000 to 6,000 calories a day, and he expected to be fed accordingly. Breakfast was hotcakes, eggs, bacon, fried potatoes, bread, and coffee. Dinner was meat, potatoes, pie, and more coffee. The camp cook worked from 3 in the morning until 8 at night and ruled his kitchen with absolute authority. Even the camp boss didn't cross the cook. Pay ranged from $2 to $5 a day, depending on the job, the company, and the decade. The most dangerous jobs paid the most. High climbers, rigging slingers, and choker setters earned top wages. Common laborers earned the least. A man who worked a full season, typically 5 to 7 months, and didn't drink or gamble away, his wages could save enough to see him through the winter. Many did drink and gamble their wages, because the towns at the edge of the timber, places like Aberdeen and Hoquiam and Eureka and Port Angeles, existed largely to separate loggers from their money through saloons, gambling halls, and houses of prostitution. Medical care was negligible. Many camps subscribed to a company doctor system where each worker paid $1 or $2 per month from his wages for the privilege of seeing a physician who visited the camp once a week or once a month or whenever he could get there from town. Serious injuries meant carrying a man out of the woods on a stretcher made from poles and blankets, loading him onto whatever wagon or rail car was available, and hauling him to the nearest town with a hospital. This journey could take half a day or longer. Many men bled out or went into shock and died before they reached help. Those who survived often faced amputation, performed on a kitchen table, by a country doctor working by lamplight. A one-armed logger was not an unusual sight in the timber towns of the Pacific Northwest. The conditions were bad enough that eventually even loggers, who were not known for political organizing, began to push back. The industrial workers of the world, the Wobblies, and sent organizers into the timber camps starting around 1905. They demanded 8-hour days instead of 10 or 12. They demanded clean bedding. They demanded that companies provide proper medical care instead of deducting wages for a doctor who never showed up. The timber companies responded the way American companies typically responded to labor organizing in that era. They fired the organizers, blacklisted the sympathizers, and in some cases, called in local police or private security to break up meetings with clubs and arrest. The 1917 lumber strike in the Pacific Northwest shut down camps across Washington and Oregon, and it took a wartime order from the federal government, desperate for spruce timber to build aircraft for the war in Europe, to force any meaningful improvements. The Spruce Production Division of the U.S. Army essentially militarized parts of the timber industry, and in the process mandated some of the basic safety and living standards that the companies had refused to provide on their own. After the war, some of those standards stuck, some didn't. Yet, the lumber kept shipping. The cities kept growing. The demand never slackened. San Francisco rebuilt itself after the 1906 earthquake with Douglas fir, and redwood hauled out of the mountains by steam donkeys. Seattle, Portland, Tacoma, Vancouver, all of them rose on old-growth timber. The railroads consumed ties by the millions. The mines consumed shoring timber by the trainload. The entire westward expansion of American infrastructure between 1880 and 1940 ran on Pacific Northwest lumber, and that lumber was moved from stump to landing by steam-powered cable machines and the men who risked their lives around them every working day. At the peak, between roughly 1900 and 1930, hundreds of steam donkeys operated simultaneously across the Pacific Northwest. Every major timber company ran fleets of them: Weyerhaeuser, Simpson Logging, Merrill and Ring, the Blottel Stewart and Welch operations up in British Columbia. The sound of a steam donkey at work, that rhythmic chuffing of the engine punctuated by the whine of cable running through blocks and the crash of logs hitting the landing, was the defining sound of the entire region for a generation. But the same relentless drive for efficiency that created the steam donkey eventually killed it, as the internal combustion engine came first. Gasoline and diesel power offered something steam could not: mobility without the constant demand for water and firewood. A steam donkey consumed staggering amounts of wood, usually cut from the very forest it was helping to log, and required a reliable water supply for its boiler. This meant camps had to be near streams or springs, or water had to be hauled in at additional cost. A diesel engine needed a tank of fuel and nothing else. By the late 1920s, diesel-powered yarders began appearing in the woods. They were lighter, more mobile, easier to maintain. They didn't throw sparks into the slash. They could be started and stopped without the long, laborious process of building steam pressure, which could take an hour or more on a cold morning. The old-timers resisted. They knew steam. They trusted steam. They had spent decades learning the sounds and the rhythms of their machines, could tell from the pitch of the exhaust whether the boiler pressure was right, could feel through the vibration in the deck whether a cable was binding or running true. They didn't trust these new diesel contraptions, and they said so loudly and often. But the economics were merciless. Diesel was cheaper to run, cheaper to move, and required fewer men to operate. Logging trucks arrived in the 1930s and 1940s, replacing the river drives and railroad spurs that had defined the industry. Chainsaws replaced crosscut saws, and a two-man crew with a gasoline-powered saw could fall a tree in minutes that would have taken an hour by hand. The entire rhythm of the industry accelerated, and the steam donkey, for all its brute power, could not keep pace. By the end of World War II, the steam donkey was finished as a commercial tool. The last operations using them wound down in the late 1940s and early 1950s. The machines were left where they sat, because nobody was going to spend the money to haul a 40-ton relic out of the forest when a diesel yarder could do the same work for a fraction of the cost. And so the steam donkeys began their long, slow return to the earth. For decades they sat in the forest, rusting, sinking into the moss and ferns as the second-growth timber rose around them. The boilers filled with rainwater and corroded from the inside. The cable drums seized. The wooden sled timbers rotted into soil. The iron and steel endured longer, but even iron surrenders to oxygen and water given enough time. If you hike through the right areas of the Pacific Northwest today, through the old timberlands of the Olympic Peninsula or the Coast Range of Oregon or the forests of Vancouver Island, you can still find them. A boiler shell sitting in a clearing grown over with salal and sword fern. A rusted drum half buried in the forest floor with fragments of cable still wound around it. A gear train frozen solid with corrosion, recognizable only by its shape. These are the gravestones of an industry that reshaped the American landscape and then moved on. A few machines were saved. The Camp 6 Logging Museum in Tacoma, Washington, preserves several working and display examples. Collier Memorial State Park in southern Oregon maintains a collection that includes donkey engines. The BC Forest Discovery Center on Vancouver Island has examples on display, and the Tillamook County Pioneer Museum in Oregon holds photographs and records from the steam logging era that document both the machinery and the men who ran it. These museum pieces, cleaned and repainted and sitting on concrete pads with interpretive signs, look almost quaint, almost harmless. Standing in a museum parking lot on a clear afternoon, it is nearly impossible to feel what it was like to work next to one of these machines when it was alive and working under full load. But try. Stand close to one and imagine the heat radiating from the boiler, so intense you can feel it through your clothes at 10 feet. The ground vibrating under your boots from the engine's rhythm. The cable running out at speed through the blocks, hissing and kicking up fragments of bark. The whistle signals that governed every movement of every man in the operation. One long blast, go ahead on the main line. 2 short blasts, stop. 3 short blasts, slack the rigging. And the sound every man in camp dreaded. No whistle at all, followed by shouting, because that meant someone was down. The men who worked these machines did not think of themselves as heroes. They did not use the word sacrifice. They were loggers. It was work. It was the hardest, most dangerous industrial labor in North America. And they did it because the work was there and the pay was better than farming, and the alternative was going hungry. They ate enormous meals, slept in miserable bunks, mailed money home when they had it, fought and drank in the timber towns when the season ended, and walked back into the forest the next spring because the logs were not going to move themselves. They built this country, not metaphorically, physically. The houses of San Francisco and Seattle and Portland, the railroad ties of the Northern Pacific and the Great Northern, the mine timbers of the Comstock and the Coeur d'Alene, the telephone poles that connected the American West, the bridges, the wharves, the schoolhouses, the churches. All of it came from trees that these men cut down and these machines dragged out of forests that seemed like they would last forever. The forests did not last forever. The old growth that took 500 years to reach maturity was logged in 50. What had seemed infinite turned out to be terrifyingly finite. By 1940, most of the accessible old growth in Washington and Oregon had been cut. The great trees that had taken root before Columbus crossed the Atlantic were reduced to lumber stacked on rail cars and barges. The ecological cost of that harvest is still being calculated, and the numbers are not kind. Salmon streams were choked with debris and destroyed by splash dams. Entire river systems that had supported runs of hundreds of thousands of fish saw their populations collapse to fractions of their former numbers. Hillsides that had been stable for millennia, held together by root systems that reached deep into the soil, eroded to bare rock and clay after the trees were removed. Winter rains that the forest canopy had once absorbed and released slowly now hammered the exposed soil directly, sending rivers of mud down into the valleys, burying roads, homes, and the streams that the salmon needed to survive. Spotted owls, marbled murrelets, and dozens of other species that had evolved over millions of years to live in the complex structure of old-growth forest found that structure disappearing around them. The timber wars of the 1980s and 1990s, those bitter fights between environmentalists and logging communities over the last remaining old-growth stands, were a direct consequence of what the steam donkey era had started. The machines were long gone by then. Sure, but the landscape they had reshaped was still reckoning with their legacy. But in the clearing where a steam donkey sat and worked and killed and produced, second-growth Douglas fir now stands 80 feet tall. The sword ferns have come back. The streams are clearing. The cable that killed Arthur Billings is a faint line of iron oxide in the soil. The forest is doing what forests do. It is reclaiming what was taken, slowly, patiently, on its own schedule. I'm indifferent to the machines and the men and the fortunes that pass through. If you have ever lived in a house with a wooden frame, if you have ever walked across a wooden floor or leaned on a wooden railing or sat on a wooden porch, then part of your daily life was built by a steam donkey and the men who worked beside it. That is the real legacy. Not the machine in the museum, not the rusted boiler in the forest. The legacy is the wood itself, in the walls around you right now. Hop still doing the job it was hauled out of the mountains to do, 100 years after the machine that moved it went cold and silent. They earned $3 a day. Some of them never collected their last paycheck. And the forests they cut built the country you are standing in right now. If you made it this far, you understand why these forgotten machines deserve to be remembered. And if you want to see how another piece of lost American industry shaped the world, that video is on screen now. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it.